Okay, Anna? You'll have to unmute yourself first.
Oh, there we go. There
That's
we go.
better. Better.
Thanks ever so much, Val, for that really nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk this evening. I've really enjoyed all of the papers that I've been able to attend in this series so far, and I think it's been lovely to have the opportunity for us to meet together as a community over the last few months. So thank you for organising these things. And I'm obviously delighted to have been included as part of this series. Just to say a couple of words about this paper, when Val approached me to ask if I might give a paper as part of this series, she suggested that I might revisit a paper that I gave I think it was 2019, but it may even have been 2018, to the Tennyson Society in Lincoln. And in that paper, I talk about the relationship between Mary Coleridge's poetry and Tennyson's poetry, and focus particularly on Coleridge's poetry and the allusions to Tennyson that she makes in those poems. And that's where I began when I was thinking about this paper, but as you'll see, it's sort of taken a slightly different turn. So without further ado, I shall begin, and we'll see where we end up. I'll just share my screen with you so that you can see the PowerPoint slides. They're just slides with the quotations that I'm going to use, and some nice photographs to keep you interested, I guess. So here we go. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint slides? Lovely. All right. Okay. So this talk is about attention. It's about the attention that we pay or fail to pay to poetry, and the ways poetry holds or slips our attention. As such, it's also a paper about power. It's about the power that a poem seeks to exert over its attentive audience, and perhaps the power that an audience has to grant or withhold its attention. I'm going to spend the first section of the talk exploring the letters and diary accounts of women who heard Tennyson perform his poetry. And then in the second section, I will employ these accounts to frame a discussion of The Princess, a poem that fashions its own attentive female audience within its framing narrative. To give you a sense of where I'm heading and to acknowledge one of my debts, let me begin by borrowing an insight from Marion Shaw's feminist study of Tennyson from 1988. Shaw's chapter on representations of love and marriage in Tennyson's poetry includes a brilliant reading of The Princess, in which Shaw observes that for the majority of the poem, Ida, the poem's princess, is, quote, in many respects, the very spirit of Victorian liberal enlightenment. But that Ida is forced to abandon her progressive outlook at the end of the poem when she is, quote, reclaimed into an unredeemed, unaltered marriage relationship. Shaw argues that this reclamation is, quote, I need to change my slide here. There we go. Sorry, I'll go back a bit. Shaw argues that this reclamation is signalled in the question of who controls language. From being a speaker, Ida becomes a listener. From being a poet, she becomes the reader of other men's poetry. Shaw's acute observation that in assuming the role of wife, Ida also assumes the role of audience, and Shaw's sense that both these roles of audience, of wife, involve a similar kind of subordination, is the germ of my discussion this evening. As I say, I'll come back to The Princess, but first I want to find some company for Ida by introducing some other women who have served as audience to other men's, in this case, Tennyson's poetry. So one of my favourite stories about Tennyson is the one in which the poet reads Maud to Jane Carlyle. Many of you will have heard it before. but it is a story about repetition, and so repeating it to you this evening feels somehow appropriate. After hearing Tennyson read the poem through once, Carlyle, not one to mince words, said she thought it was, quote, perfect stuff. Tennyson, assuming that his audience had failed to understand the poem, read it again. It was only after a third reading that Mrs. Carlyle finally, and perhaps expediently, admitted that she liked it very much. In a letter to her uncle's widow, Mrs. George Welsh, Mrs. Carlyle exclaimed, "God help me! What a number of distinguished men have passed through this house since I came into it. There have been poets, Alfred Tennyson among them, going about asking everybody if they liked his Maud, and reading Maud aloud, and talking Maud, 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 till I wished myself far away among people who only wrote prose, or who neither read nor write at all." Carlyle's letter takes revenge on the laureate for making her his captive audience for the several hours it must have taken to read his lengthy monodrama 3 times. Her description of Tennyson, quote, talking Maud, 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 is, of course, an allusion to one of the poem's most well-known lyrics, birds in the high hall garden, when the twilight was falling, Maud, 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 Maud. They were crying and calling. It paints Tennyson as his deranged and lovelorn protagonist, and his poem, rather than the woman for whom it is named, as the object of his monomania. It also reveals Mrs. Carlyle to be a more attentive audience to Tennyson's poetry than perhaps he gave her credit for. I want to say more about Mrs. Carlyle's sharp interpretation of Tennyson's performance, but first I'd like to position it among a broader selection of writing by women that describes Tennyson reading his poetry aloud. We know that Tennyson liked to read his work aloud, and we also know that he believed that he was the only person with the sensitivity and, most importantly, lung capacity to do his work justice. One of the best and most famous pictures of Tennyson is D.G. Rossetti's sketch of Tennyson reading Maud. It's a sketch that I love, and I particularly love the kind of restlessness of this image. I think the way Tennyson is sort of grabbing at his own leg, and the fact that Rossetti seems slightly undecided as to where Tennyson's other foot is just suggests the kind of a slightly antic nature perhaps to Tennyson's performance. And then again, one of the funniest caricatures of Tennyson, this one by Max Beerbohm, imagines the laureate reading in memoriam to his sovereign. Again, in this image, Tennyson is all kind of hands and feet, and his flailing arms contrast really starkly with the very neat, contained posture of Queen Victoria. Eric Griffiths and Angela Layton have dwelt with sensitivity and insight on the way Tennyson's voice sounds through the printed text of his poetry and the poetry of his 20th century successors.
And Anna, can I interrupt just for a moment? We can't see your PowerPoints.
Oh,
have you pressed share screen?
let me just, sorry about that. It's a shame that you can't see the images. Let me just see. Let's try that again. How's that?
That's perfect. That's
okay. Let's try that again. I'm sure you know the pictures that I was referring to, but there's that lovely image of Rossetti, of Tennyson by Rossetti that I was just talking about. And here is that famous caricature of Tennyson reading in memoriam to Queen Victoria, an event, of course, that never happened. So Eric Griffiths and Angela Layton have dwelt with sensitivity and insight on the way Tennyson's voice sounds through the printed text of his poetry and the poetry of his 20th century successors. In the popular and critical imagination, it is Tennyson and his poetry that has held our attention in these records of performance. How could it not? His physical presence, his voice, his words loom large and sound loud in these scenes of reading. Less interesting, perhaps, are the roles played by and the experience recorded by his audience, particularly when that audience is, as it often was, comprised of one or more women. I first came to consider these female audiences through my work on Mary Elizabeth Coleridge, the late 19th century poet, novelist and critic, and I came to them in particular through my encounter with a diary account of a visit that Coleridge made to Freshwater in the Easter of 1889. I've written about this diary in relation to Coleridge's engagement with Tennyson's poetry in her own compositions. But the diary also offers a self-portrait of Coleridge as audience. On her first evening at Freshwater, Tennyson, fulfilling a promise he had made to Coleridge earlier that day, invites her alone up to his study. "Where are you going to?" Mrs. Tennyson said. "I'm going to have a tete-a-tete with Miss..." There's nothing improper in it. And off he set for the turret. "Oh, dearest of men," cried Mrs. R. Ritchie, rushing after us. "I can't allow that." She clasped her hands. He went straight on up the winding staircase. She ran back, and presently in she came, followed by a small troop who she arranged all around. "If I'd known you were all coming, I could have read downstairs." He looked the picture of an old magician, sitting there on the sofa, his little pointed woolly black cap on. On another occasion, Coleridge was accompanied by her friend, Ella Coltman, a young woman who claimed a family connection with Arthur Hugh Clough. Coltman's account of her visit offers a glimpse of the poet as something of a prima donna. "He was just like a big baby," she says, "restless, irritable, refusing to read aloud. 'I'm cross, I can't read. You don't really care for it. Don't ask me. I am grim and dreary tonight.'" The infantile petulance displayed by the great poet in this brief sketch shares something of Mrs. Carlyle's satirical perspective. It also contributes to the sense that Tennyson was quite demanding of his audiences, requiring their sympathy and care. We get something similar from Annie Thackeray's memoir of Tennyson. As John Aplin has described, Annie Thackeray, the daughter of W.M. Thackeray, developed a close connection with Tennyson and his family, especially following the death of her father, and visited them at Freshwater and Aldworth fairly frequently. Thackeray's memoir records an anecdote about an unnamed authoress who was present at another of Tennyson's performances of Maud. Tennyson was reading the poem to a silent company in the twilight, and when he came to the birds in the high hall garden calling Maud, 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 he stopped short and asked the authoress, who happened to be present, what birds these were. The authoress, much alarmed and feeling that she must speak and that the eyes of the company were upon her, faltered out, "Nightingales?" "Pooh," said Tennyson, "what a cockney you are. Nightingales don't say Maud, rooks do, or something like it. Caw, 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 caw." Then he went on reading. I don't know if that nightingales and cockney is a reference to Keats there, but it's a really interesting one, I think. Blanche Ware Cornish, who with her husband Francis was also a frequent visitor at Freshwater, offers a similar account of Tennyson reading Maud. "To my surprise, I was taken to the study and found the bard alone. All through the reading, he relied on the close verbal attention of the listener. He suddenly dropped his voice and asked after the line, 'The dusky strand of death.' 'What is that strand?' 'Sure,' was replied. 'You missed the word interwoven. It is the interwoven strand of a rope.'" So each of these small narratives echoes to a greater or lesser degree the bathos and humour of Jane Carlisle's account, the one that I began with. And it is a short step from these snapshots of Tennyson reading to the overt satire of Virginia Woolf's play Freshwater, throughout which the elderly poet's attempts to read Maud are repeatedly thwarted by the increasingly absurd comings and goings of the other dramatis personae. Woolf was the niece of Julia Margaret Cameron, Tennyson's neighbour at his Isle of Wight home, and the similarities between her play and the epistolary and diary accounts suggest that Woolf had heard these stories herself, perhaps. The Coleridge diary that I quoted from a moment ago contains a couple of references to Jane Austen, and although this is likely to be coincidental because part of the pleasures of Coleridge's diary is the compendious and undiscriminating range of observations and conversational snippets that Coleridge includes, there is something of the flavour of Austen's satire in Coleridge's and others' descriptions of Tennyson reading. A comedy that relies on the reader failing to do justice to his material or falling short of his audience's sense of an ideal reader. Mr. Collins, for example, reading with monotonous solemnity from Fordyce's sermons, or in Pride and Prejudice, Edward Ferrars reading Cooper with an impenetrable calmness that frustrates Marianne. Added to the gentle, or at times not so gentle, satirization of the bard in later life, these epistolary and diaristic accounts of Tennyson reading offer an experiential account of what it was like to listen to Tennyson, to be in the room with Tennyson when he performed his poetry. Blanche Ware Cornish refers to the close verbal attention that Tennyson demanded of his audience. And prompted by this description, I would like to consider how these different descriptions of Tennyson reading encourage us to reflect on the nature and role of attention as central to the various experiences of these audiences, before I move on to consider how Tennyson's poetry itself invites, commands, or perhaps somehow evades or puts off the attention of the reader. One reason that it might be interesting to consider what these narratives have to tell us about attention is that they coincide with a significant period for the history of attention as a philosophical, psychological, and cultural concept. Jonathan Crary's authoritative study of attention, modernity, and the visual arts shows us that, in his words, attention became a decisively new kind of problem in the 19th century. One which Crary connects to the emergence of a social, urban, psychic, and industrial field increasingly saturated with sensory input. That's Crary there. Crary describes a context in which attention is no longer a given, but is instead a debatable site of encounter between the modern subject and an increasingly fragmented reality. I want to just zero in on a couple of these debates about attention before going on to consider how they might usefully frame those different accounts of what it was like to pay attention to Tennyson at the end of the 19th century. The first debate that Crary outlines, and these aren't the only two that he covers, they're just the two that I found most helpful. But the first debate I want to talk about is over whether attention is a passive reflex or a decisive act of will. Does the world command our attention, or do we direct our attention towards the world? As the 19th century progressed, philosophy and psychology moved towards an understanding of attention as an assertion of subjectivity, so that in 1890, William James can write, "Everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneous possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence." This muscular account of attention has an affinity with liberal traditions of subjectivity in the way that it offers attention as an extension or expression of individual freedom. Despite the offhand confidence of James's description, everybody knows what attention is. This kind of willed attention does not survive long into the 20th century, falling victim to the birth of psychoanalysis, which sees attention as in thrall to the subconscious, and to modernity, which produces a diffuse and distracting array of realities that refuse to be contained within the field of a singular, attentive gaze. The second debate I want to mention, one that is very much tangled up with the first, is to do with where attention happens. Is attention an act of mind, or is it an embodied experience? At the same time that James, along with Henri Bergson, sought to claim attention to the autonomous individual, philosophers influenced by Kantian idealism sought a mode of attention that was, to quote Crary, radically cut from the process and activities of the body. So one taking place in an ideal, atemporal space. This kind of attention has affinities with late century aestheticism and to the possibility that art might offer the opportunity to immerse the viewer, the reader, the audience in an experience that is purified of the quotidian concerns of the mortal material body. So that was a sort of whistle-stop tour of two very complex debates, right? But I'm going to move us back to Tennyson and to his audiences now. So how do these debates invite us to interpret the attentive audiences at Tennyson's readings? At the risk of overemphasizing the distinction between the two kinds of debate that I have just outlined, I want first to consider the question of attention and the will. At first glance, James's definition of attention as something freely directed by an autonomous subject towards an object of perception feels very much at odds with the diary accounts penned by Tennyson's female audiences. If anything, Jamesian attention serves to hold a mirror up to these narratives that shows a reversal of its implicit power dynamics. For these women, bound by good manners, bound by the rules of hospitality, and conscious of Tennyson's eminence and celebrity, attention is not so much asserted or directed, as James would have it, as it is paid or even commanded. At the same time, the diaries and memoirs reveal an attention that is not consistently obedient to the will of the performer. The humour of each account relies on an author or an audience who does indeed pay detailed attention to the scene she witnesses, but who does not necessarily focus or direct her attention as the speaker would wish. Rather than offering the, quote, close verbal attention that Tennyson requires, a kind of attention that perhaps does resemble James's description of a taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seem several simultaneous possible objects or trains of thought. Instead of this, Coleridge, Coltman, Carlyle, and Cornish describe a more diffuse mode of attention, one that does not necessarily take possession of a single object, but is instead alive to the simultaneous variety of their experience, the voice, the poem, the poet, but also the material details of the space they occupy, their own bodies in relation to the speaker. This might strike us as an impoverished kind of attention, something more akin to distraction even. And yet it is this kind of attention that allows these women to assert their subjectivity, noticing, observing, and granting consequence to aspects of experience that resist the gravitational pull of Tennyson's reading. Now, it's tempting to say something glib here about the feminine gift for multitasking, to focus on more than one thing at once. And in fact, I don't need to, because William James says it for me. He speculates about the feminine capacity to bring a focus to a number of things at once, writing, quote, "Women in general train their peripheral visual attention more than men." From our 21st century vantage point, we can speculate further and suggest that this feminine capacity is conditioned by necessity, by the vigilance a patriarchal culture demands women to practice within any given situation, or by an habituation to meeting the competing demands for attention that women traditionally experience as their lot. Sarah Ahmed's philosophy of orientation is illuminating on this point. Imagining the position of the mother attempting to sit down at her desk to work, Ahmed writes, "Giving attention to the objects of writing, facing those objects becomes impossible. The children, even if they are behind you, literally pull you away. This loss of time for writing feels like a loss of your own time as you are returned to the work of giving your attention to the children. Attention involves a political economy or an uneven distribution of attention time between those who arrive at the writing table, which affects what they can do once they arrive. And of course, many do not even make it. For some, having time for writing, which means time to face the objects upon which writing happens, becomes an orientation that is not available given the ongoing labour of other attachments, which literally pull you away." So Sarah Ahmed is talking about artists rather than about audiences here. But her point, I think, can be applied into the scene of the poetry reading. If focused attention signals the individual at liberty, diffuse, distracted attention is a symptom of constraint. At the same time, this familiar story of feminine constraint does not quite do justice to these memoirs and journals, which, as we have seen, are so witty and sly and subversive. Another way of thinking through the political economy of attention in these scenes is offered by Ahmed's image of the child pulling at the attention of the mother who wishes to spend time at her desk. Reading this, I was reminded of Ella Coltman's description of Tennyson. Remember, just a moment ago, I quoted from her diary where she describes Tennyson as being just like a big baby, restless, irritable, refusing to read aloud. Now, this is a casually irreverent image, but it does allow us to reorient our understanding of attention in these scenes, aligning listening to Tennyson with other kinds of domestic labour that command the attention of daughters, wives, and mothers. It allows us to reconceive the diaries, memoirs, and letters less as ephemera and more as art objects in their own right, attentive sketches of Tennyson reading, which bring both art, artist, and audience into the frame, quietly insisting on their connection to one another. This brings me back to that second account of attention, the one related to an ideal tradition of aestheticism. Because if these attentive narratives model a diffuse kind of attention, they also model an attention that is both embodied and temporal. Mary Coleridge's journal includes a number of descriptions of her own physical awkwardness within these scenes of reading. She refers to her nervousness in Tennyson's presence, writing, "Again, from pure nervousness, when we went up in the afternoon about 5, I sat right down in front of his toast at the tea table." I like the use of tea there. It could be tea as in cup of tea or tea as in Tennyson, the Tennyson table. And then, again from pure nervousness, I drank my tea without any milk. He offered me brown bread and butter. Presently, a hand was laid on my arm. I feel like there's something also a little bit kind of Alice in Wonderland about this description. Coleridge is acutely conscious of her gauche behaviour in these scenes, capturing the familiar experience of self-defeating self-consciousness. Her body appears to act almost beyond her control, taking Tennyson's place at the tea table, forgetting to put milk in her tea. Far from drawing her out of herself into a realm of pure aesthetic experience, the poetry reading pulls her into her body. The diary employs a tone of wry regret, suggesting that Coleridge experiences her body as an inconvenience in these auspicious moments. Coleridge's acute physical self-consciousness in these scenes can be interpreted as further evidence of her subordinate position. There is a sense in which Coleridge might be said to other herself in these moments. She becomes visible to herself through a patriarchal lens that holds her to certain standards of social grace and politeness. For this reason, she is unable to lose herself to the aesthetic experience of the poetry reading or gain access to a purely ideal realm. Coleridge's sense of bodily awkwardness is also a product of the conventions of the diaristic account, which prioritize the temporal and the material, allowing the author to practice a different kind of attention, one that acknowledges the material conditions of the aesthetic that an ideal attention chooses to turn away from. It is not that Coleridge's concern with her various social faux pas preclude her ability to pay attention to Tennyson reading. Her diary includes detailed recollections of the readings themselves. It is more that her diary insists on the aesthetic as an embodied temporal phenomena, one which therefore cannot be purified of the bodies and bodily relationships that produce it. These women's accounts of an embodied, temporal, subordinate, yet also subversively diffuse attention has led me to look beyond 19th century psychology and aesthetic philosophy for a model that better fits the experiences they recount in their journals and letters. In 1961, in an essay entitled Against Dryness, Iris Murdoch called for a new vocabulary of attention. She writes, "We need to turn our attention away from the consoling dream necessity of romanticism, away from the dry symbol, the bogus individual, the false whole, towards the real, impenetrable human person." Murdoch's desire that we direct our attention differently relates to a concern that contemporary fiction has lost interest in the messy, contingent reality, which for Murdoch constitutes fiction's unique access to the truth, and therefore its ethical purpose. This re-evaluation of attention builds on the philosophy of Simone Weil, who, in a departure from William James, places attention and the will in opposition to one another. In her essay, Attention and Will, Weil argues that we have to try to cure our faults by attention and not by will. And she suggests that the will is a limited and limiting capacity or expression of humanity. What could be more stupid, she writes, than to tighten our muscles and set our jaws about virtue or poetry or the solution to a problem? Attention is something quite different. Weil connects attention to two other human faculties, to what she describes as, quote, the creative faculty, and to, quote, desire, or more exactly, consent. This creative, desiring attention is passive and self-abnegating. I'm quoting from Weil again here. All that I call I has to be passive. Attention alone, that attention which is so full that the I disappears, is required of me. I have to deprive all that I call I of the light of my attention and turn it onto that which cannot be conceived. Now, it won't have escaped your attention that Vey's re-evaluation of attention is not a perfect fit for the kind of attention practiced and described in the journals and letters of Tennyson's female audiences. Journals, by definition, and as we have seen, are centrally concerned with the I, and so they cannot achieve that complete disappearance that Vey requires of her attentive subject. However, what we can take from Vey and from Murdoch is their interest in attention as an artistic practice, one that, nevertheless, is carried out via consensual surrender of power. In other words, the attention offered by the women who listen to Tennyson's poetry can be, through Vey and through Murdoch, reframed as a kind of poetic practice in and of itself, one that perhaps offers us a route back to the attentive dynamics of Tennyson's own poetry. And that's where I'm going to take us now. For Murdoch, the kinds of artistic attention that she and Vey describe belong primarily to fiction. Indeed, Murdoch's argument is partly motivated by a sense that contemporary fiction has been too heavily influenced by what she describes as the, quote, crystalline nature of romantic and post-romantic poetry. I have tried to show how this way of thinking about attention might also reframe the attentive observations of Mary Coleridge and her fellow diarists and letter writers as a kind of artistic labour. But might Tennyson's poetry respond to this kind of thinking through attention as well? In The Princess, Tennyson raises the question of attention by imagining an audience for his mock-heroic reactionary romance. The tale is narrated by a group of university undergraduates at the request of two women, Lilia, the younger sister of one of the undergraduates, and her maiden aunt, Elizabeth, whose name is strikingly similar to Lilia. They seem to be kind of perhaps ciphers of one another. These two women suggest that their male companions should invent a story to kill the idle hours of their summer vacation. They are prompted to make this request following a bantering argument about Lilia's exclusion from the university where her brother and his friends have spent much of their year. Walter tries to win Lilia round by claiming that he and his friends spend their time at university longing for female company and coming up with different ways to distract themselves from its absence. We did but talk you over, pledge you all in wassail, often like as many girls sick for the hollies and yews of home, as many little trifling Lilias, played charades and riddles as at Christmas here, and what's my thought, and where, and when, and how, and often told a tale from mouth to mouth, as here at Christmas. According to Walter's account, the telling of tales is an activity prompted by the absence of female company. Stories are told by men to men. Stories, and by extension other forms of creative expression, including poetry, compensate for female absence. And we might speculate that they reroute the libidinous energies that might more properly be directed towards heterosexual courtship. This argument might lead towards a sense that storytelling and female company are equivalents, and that they are also to an extent mutually exclusive, the one precluding the need for the other. But Lilia and Elizabeth reject this formulation, asking, why not now? Why not a summer's as a winter's tale? This back and forth invites us to consider the significance of the novel presence of a female audience for these young men's creative efforts, and asks us to observe what their attentive presence brings to this poem, to the story of the princess. I suggest that this significance is made manifest via the lyrics that punctuate the story of Ida and her unnamed suitor. The poem's narrator describes the lyrics thus: "So I began, and the rest followed, and the women sang between the rougher voices of the men, like linnets in the pauses of the wind." This rather lovely simile associates the interstitial lyrics with moments of pause, in which we hear something not otherwise audible over the louder sound of the wind. According to this account, the lyrics become a sort of inverse of Seamus Heaney's description of the space around the poem. This is a phrase he uses in his wonderful essay, The Redress of Poetry. He's talking about those bits of blank page that frame our engagement with a poem, or perhaps shape our attention. Here, the lyrics themselves become that attentive space, bodying forth the often invisible and silent presence of the poem's audience, and inviting us to recognize the labor of its, and maybe by extension of our, attention. In one sense, this interpretation of the lyrics that Tennyson included in The Princess is counterintuitive. Lyric is more readily associated with that kind of pure aesthetic attention, atemporal and disembodied, which the journals and letters I have been exploring reject, with the will, and with that crystalline vision that Iris Murdoch critiques. And yet, in another sense, these lyrics do serve to return us to our bodies and to the here and now of our experience as readers or as audience. Take this, for example. It's one of my favourites from The Princess. "Now sleeps the crimson petal, now the white, nor waves the cypress in the palace walk, nor winks the gold fin in the porphyry font, the firefly wakens, waken thou with me." In this first stanza of the penultimate lyric from The Princess, we are drawn into a shared present. The poem's first word sets up an invocation that echoes through the following lines. Now becomes nor waves, nor winks, and even waken thou with. The now, 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 becoming a sound that speaks to our senses, making our attentive bodies known to ourselves in the legible absence of other visible stimuli. This lyric in particular foreshadows and motivates Ida's implied acceptance of the prince's hand in marriage, that moment when, as Marion Shaw observes, Ida ceases to be a poet and becomes the poet's audience. What I hope to have shown via this discussion of other women who occupied that same role and wrote private accounts of their experience is that, in becoming his audience, Ida is no less an artist, and that her attentive labour, along with the labour of the women that listened to Tennyson read his poetry aloud, can be understood as a vital aspect of creative practice. I'll conclude with the narrator of The Princess, who himself concludes, "The women, and perhaps they felt their power, for something in the ballads which they sang, or in their silent influence as they sat, had ever seemed to wrestle with burlesque, and drove us last to quite a solemn close." Thank you.